Well, J. Robert Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb. He directed the civilian laboratory at Los Alamos during World War II, during the Manhattan Project. And under his leadership, he directed Nobel Prize-winning scientists, engineers, military personnel, and the civilians who worked on the atomic bomb project in Los Alamos. Humans back to ancient Greece have been wanting to split the atom. They've talked about an indivisible part of matter. And so that's a concept that had been around for a while. But humans still haven't seen an atom. I mean, it's so small, we haven't seen it. And it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that scientists started being able to tinker with doing things, smashing things together, and kind of figuring out what came out, kind of like you smash a car together and the carburetor comes out, and not knowing what a carburetor is, you go, we know that's something in the car, but we don't know. So that's kind of, in a very basic way, what atomic physics was about. But then in 1938, two German physicists working in Berlin, Strassmann and Hahn, bombarded this lump of material called uranium, and they got a curious result. It kind of released a lot of heat, and then it created a different element, element that was farther down on the the element table of elements. The word about this spread through the nuclear physics world like a forest fire. That scientists had split the atom, and that it was scientists working in Nazi Germany that had split the atom. So there was a lot of knowledge that the Germans had split the atom, that England was working on their own splitting of the atom and harnessing that into a military weapon. But it wasn't until after Pearl Harbor that then the Manhattan Project was created, and then a lot of resources under the control of the Army Corps of Engineers was devoted to create this new weapon. So Leslie R. Groves was appointed the head of the Manhattan Project, and he had just finished building the Pentagon. Groves talked to different physics departments and asked people who would be a good leader, and Oppenheimer probably was not high on the list. Actually, Oppenheimer had not even been in charge of his physics department at Berkeley before he was chosen to be the head of the Central Laboratory. But there was something about Oppie that Groves liked. I think a couple things. Groves saw that he was hungry. There were Nobel Prize winners that were being considered, but they had already accomplished the Nobel Prize. Groves wanted somebody who was hungrier and would maybe work a little bit harder. And also on a train trip across the country, Oppie was able to describe to Groves what was needed to be done in terms that Groves, that a layman, could understand. So Groves picked Oppie. The other thing was where to locate the Central Laboratory. You couldn't have it in Chicago, because what happens if an accident happened? Or also it'd be easy to breach the top security. If you're walking down a street involved in it, a colleague who wasn't involved came up and said, "Hey Joe, what are you doing?" Well, I mean, there would be an easy way to break top secrecy on that. So they looked around. They picked some places in the West. Oppie had come to New Mexico to recover from an illness when he was 18 years old, and had fallen in love with New Mexico. At one point, he said that he wished he could marry the two loves of his life, physics and New Mexico. Of course, that's before he got married. I just want to be clear about that. And this was an opportunity for him to do that. So he showed Groves some places around New Mexico, and they settled on this boys' school at Los Alamos. And so after that was chosen in November of 1942, Oppie started recruiting people. But he couldn't tell them what he was doing. He said, I would like you to join me on this project, but I can't really tell you what you're going to be doing. But you're going to be in a beautiful place, and it's going to be essential for the war effort. And people who knew Oppie kind of knew they knew the work that was being done in Germany. They knew that this was going to be something that was going to be important. So a lot of people did sign on. They were given an address in Santa Fe to report to. They went to that 109 East Palace address right near the plaza in Santa Fe, and then we're told, well, you're not quite there, just another 40 miles. Here's your temporary security pass to get into Los Alamos. And so we got in there. Scientists assembled in March of 1943. They they decided that they needed to do multiple ways of trying to make this weapon. And part of the problem was the nuclear material, the uranium or plutonium. It was minuscule. Plutonium's totally man-made. And so a reactor in Hanford, Washington was created to then manufacture this plutonium. Uranium is naturally made, but the part that's used for bombs is only about 1% of what occurs in nature. So how do you refine that out? How do you extract that 1% out? And that's why the big industrial complex at Oak Ridge was made, to kind of separate this isotope of uranium from the rest of it and then assemble it so in a big enough quantity that it could be used for a bomb. So part of the delay was the material, was the radioactive material, the nuclear material. Part of it was trying to figure out how to assemble this into a bomb, and there were two different ways. One was a gun assembly bomb, and that took uranium in one part of the bomb, and uranium in another part of the bomb, had high explosives behind it. It's kind of like a bullet. So this bullet of uranium was shot into this bigger mass of uranium, enriched uranium, uranium-235, and that then caused the chain reaction that exploded, and with a huge detonation. That was a pretty simple technique or a simple idea. It was actually so simple that they didn't need to test it. That was the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, but they were so sure that that was going to work, they didn't field test it. The plutonium bomb's a little bit different. They tried to do that gun assembly with plutonium, but it kind of, as soon as it got shot, it just kind of fell apart. So it never got to the other lump of plutonium. So what they came up with was this idea of implosion. So you have this pit of plutonium about the size of a softball or a grapefruit. Around it you have conventional explosives. You detonate those conventional explosives all within the same millisecond, so that the shock wave that comes onto the core compresses the plutonium into a tighter and tighter mass, and that's then when you get the chain reaction and the splitting of the plutonium atoms and the release of an explosion. The scientists weren't so sure that would work because it's tricky. If the explosives, conventional explosives, arrive at the core just a little bit before the other shock wave, then it would just blow the plutonium out. So it had to be coordinated. That's the one they tested at Trinity site, about 200 miles southeast of Los Alamos, on July 16, 1945, at about 5:30 in the morning. Oppie later thought of a phrase from the Bhagavad Gita, the holy book of Hinduism, that now I am a destroyer of worlds. Now I am death, destroyer of worlds. Just to put this in perspective, that one bomb, when it was dropped over Japan, had the explosive and destructive equivalent of 2,000 of our biggest bombers used in the war fully loaded. So it would have to be 2,000 of those bombers fully loaded, dropping all of their loads to equal the destructive power of one atomic weapon. Oppenheimer felt about his work during the Manhattan Project in, I think, a kind of complicated way. And I think he had some mixed feelings of the fact that he did create this weapon of mass destruction. But on the other hand, he ended the war. Now, I don't think the atomic weapons won the war. The war was already won. It was won by the United States military and our allies. It was won by the home front and the people working in the factories. And a lot of people won the war. But the war ended in August of 1945 because of the atomic bomb. And I think Oppie realized this and took some pride in the fact that even though it was a horrendous weapon, possibly some lives were saved because of the use of it. As deadly as the weapon was, a home invasion of, an invasion of the home islands of Japan probably would have created more casualties. That's something that historians debate. We'll never know the answer. But I think he also felt somewhat bad about it. Late in life, in the 1960s, he and his wife Kitty visited Japan, and a journalist said, well, how do you feel about your work in developing this weapon that was used on Japan? Do you feel bad about it? And Oppie's reply was, it's not that I don't feel bad about it. I don't feel worse about it tonight than I did last night. By the time the 1950s rolled around, he started getting concerned about the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. He started feeling it. And in one article in Foreign Affairs, he said, it's like there's two scorpions in a bottle, and they're going to kill each other. He also was worried about the effect of secrecy on our democracy. And he became more and more vocal, questioning the nuclear policies of the country. But he was influential. He was on the General Advisory Committee, that were the civilian committee that advised the Atomic Energy Committee. So, and he had made some enemies along the way. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover had put him, even before World War II, on a list to be detained in case of a national emergency as a suspicious person. Oppenheimer in the 1930s had participated in left-wing activities. His wife Kitty was a Communist Party member. His brother and his sister-in-law were Communist Party members. So Hoover thought that he was a Communist Party member. That's never been proven, but he was left-leaning. Lewis Strauss, who was the director of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1953, didn't like Oppie, partly for just kind of petty personal reasons. Edward Teller didn't like Oppie because Teller thought he should have been appointed the head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos and not Hans Bethe. So there were these people that kind of got together in the early 50s to take down Oppie. And some of it was for petty reasons, some of it was for security reasons. Maybe he was connected with the Soviet Union. But also I think it's because we as a country had come to a fork in the road. And Oppie was saying, maybe we should be rethinking this fork that we're going down in nuclear weapons. Maybe we should go a different way. And so in December of 1953, a report was given to President Eisenhower saying more probably than not, Oppenheimer was a Soviet spy. So, of course, Ike then created a wall around Oppie. Oppenheimer still had his top security clearance. So what to do about that? A couple days before Christmas in 1953, Lewis Strauss had Oppie come into his office and say, you know, there's this report about you and we're going to have to remove your top security clearance, and you can either go quietly and nobody will know, or we can have a hearing. But this was, in a way, a public humiliation. It was supposed to be secret. Soon after it ended, the 997-page transcript was released to newspapers. It was made public so that everybody heard what had happened with Oppenheimer, and that they never proved he was a security risk. The second charge against him was that he advocated against the hydrogen bomb, and he did say that hydrogen bomb was, the atomic bombs are powerful enough. Hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Oppie was against the hydrogen bomb. Did he try to coordinate scientists not working on it? That was the charge. He might have talked to some people saying that atomic bombs are powerful enough and we don't need to unleash 1,000 times more powerful bombs. But nonetheless, in a public, humiliating way, his top security clearance was yanked. Newspapers across the country had front-page articles about this. And so he went from 1945 being this hero that ended World War II to 1954 being this villain that maybe was a communist spy. So when Oppenheimer brought nuclear physics west, first to Berkeley and to Caltech, and then to New Mexico, he changed, particularly New Mexico, into what had been a very poor part of the country that actually even today some people don't know that New Mexico is part of the United States. They think it's a part of Mexico. I get that all the time. Oh, you don't have much of an accent. It's like, because I'm from the United States when I say I'm from New Mexico. But it brought this state that was poor, had very little infrastructure, and put in the middle of it this federally funded facility that just transformed the state. It brought good paying jobs. I mentioned the scientists, the engineers, the military who came to Los Alamos, but also during the Manhattan Project and then afterwards, a lot of local people in northern New Mexico got well-paying jobs at the laboratories. So it transformed. In the 1960s, the Peace Corps sent volunteers to New Mexico to train before they sent them down into Latin America. Now Los Alamos is one of the most prosperous counties in the country. They say up there that they have the highest per capita number of PhDs in the country in their county. So it's transformed the state. There's a lot of spin-offs that come from research into nuclear physics that then people decide they don't want to work at Los Alamos, start their own businesses, and then so there's a kind of a ripple effect throughout northern New Mexico and into Albuquerque of people who have these high-tech jobs, come up with a good idea, and then spin them off for their own businesses. So it took this state that was in the kind of the backwaters of the country and not well known unless you were a tourist and came through and saw the beautiful landscapes and the interesting cultures of New Mexico, and made it more mainstream. So what lessons do we learn from Oppenheimer? We still refer to a massive effort to use science and government and business to come up with a solution of the world's problems. We say, well, we need to do a Manhattan Project on this. So we still have that in the back of our minds, that there is this almost impossible feat that was accomplished by dedicated people working hard to come up with something that nobody else had ever done before. So we still take lessons from that and from Oppenheimer's leadership in that. But it's a mixed legacy. Partly it's a mixed legacy because of Cleocide, partly it's a mixed legacy because of the nuclear power plant accidents that happened, Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Partly it's a mixed legacy because of the divided opinions of the public, of looking at people who work at Los Alamos as either saviors of our democracy or shadowy figures who have their fingers on Armageddon. I mean, it's a complicated thing to try to wrap your head around, and a lot of times there's no black and white easy answers on this.